HMS Indefatigable began life as an Ardent-class third-rate ship of the line, a class that was designed by Sir Thomas Slade, who was a prolific and successful designer of wooden warships of the mid-18th century, later also famous for designing HMS Victory, a first-rate that would take over half a century to better in practical design terms. The Ardent class would also incidentally contain another of Nelson's favourite ships, the HMS Agamemnon. Although the design of the ship itself dated to the early 1760s, the Indefatigable was not ordered until 1780, well after the death of her designer. She would complete into the Navy 4 years later, but by the mid-1780s, the third-rate ship of the line was more and more commonly a 74-gun ship, and the 60 to 64 gun designs of the mid-18th century and earlier were simply no longer competitive in the line of battle. But at the same time, they were also too large and slow for use as frigates, as well as being quite manpower intensive. As a result, the ship was commissioned directly into ordinary, which basically equates to being put straight into reserve upon completion. But about a decade later, in 1794, the Royal Navy was getting properly stuck into the Napoleonic Wars and found it needed every ship it could get. The 64, however, was still not a particularly useful ship, Agamemnon aside, but the British had a cunning plan. They decided to make her into a razee frigate, a then new concept that involved taking a deck off of an existing small ship of the line in order to make a heavy frigate. The advantages to this were that the ship would have the much heavier hull of a line ship, along with the sail and rigging that was needed to move the entire ship along, now propelling a much lighter load. This meant great speed, durability, and gunpower, since the heavy main battery could be supported as well by the remaining heavy hull beams. It was a perfect use for smaller ships of the line that were no longer useful in the line of battle, but would have proven far too expensive as a concept to build from the ground up in any large numbers. Along with HMS Anson and HMS Magnanime, she would pioneer this idea. The upper gun deck and all guns above this level were removed, leaving a battery of 26 long-barrel 24-pounder guns on her main gun deck, and after some argument, 8 long-barreled 12-pounder guns on her quarterdeck and a further 4 chase guns in her forecastle were supplemented by 4 short-range 42-pounder carronades on the quarterdeck and another 2 on the forecastle, resulting in a 44-gun, fifth-rate frigate. She would later sneak another couple of 12-pounders aboard without changing her official rating, which was a common practice to a greater or lesser degree in most navies at the time. In its new guise, HMS Indefatigable would be first commissioned into active service in December 1794 under Captain Sir Edward Pellew, who would prove to be an incredibly skilled officer and also one of the main protagonists of the Hornblower series of books. With war coming up, it's perhaps best to let this clip from the TV series of the same name introduce both him and the situation that the Indefatigable faced.
Sir Edward Pellew, and I'm here to tell you your days of idling are over. You have a mind to fight. That is well, for you shall have your fill. Yesterday, His Majesty received a communication from Paris. The revolutionary government in France has declared war on Britain. The old adversary may wear a new face, but whatever mask he chooses to hide behind, a Frenchman is still a Frenchman, and we will beat him as we always have beaten him. For there is no power on earth that can withstand the might of the British Navy. God save the King! God save the King!
And so, setting out in early 1795 in company with 2 other frigates, Indefatigable immediately got involved in taking numerous French warships as prizes. Incidentally, I highly recommend reading the London Gazette for this period, as it's full of a truly hilarious number of prizes taken and money paid out to dozens of Royal Navy ships and crews. Anyway, later in the year, the ship would also rescue survivors from a vessel that had gone aground. 1796 was no less bountiful, chasing off French corvettes and taking or sinking numerous merchant ships, and all before the spring was even over. At this point, she was operating in concert with a number of other frigates, including HMS Amazon, which we will meet later on. After this short break operating against enemy merchant shipping, the Indefatigable got back to the task of turning large parts of the French Navy into parts of the Royal Navy. In company with HMS Révolutionnaire, itself a captured French frigate, she would capture the French frigate Unité. This was followed by a long chase and battle with the French 44-gun frigate Virginie, which ended when HMS Concorde and HMS Amazon caught up and forced the French vessel to surrender. Although the battle had taken almost 2 hours and the French ship had, to a degree, outmanoeuvred the Indefatigable, the British ship had sustained little damage and sustained no casualties, whereas the French ship had about 4 dozen casualties and 4 feet of water in the hold. In large part, this was due to the French technique of trying to fire at an enemy's mast and rigging to dismast it so they could get away, as opposed to the British practice of just shooting at the ship's hull to cause as much damage as humanly possible. Both of these prizes were inducted into the Royal Navy, with the initial prize money payout for the 2 ships, not even the full amount, adding up to £20,000. That was almost as much as it had cost to build the Indefatigable in the first place. By straight inflation, that's the equivalent of just over £2 million in today's money, but in terms of actual purchasing power, it was worth closer to what £20 million would be today. This was shared across 5 ships, including Indefatigable. It's worth a quick diversion here to briefly explain the prize system. Basically, in times of war, if a ship was captured and brought home, then the ship and any cargo belonged to the Crown, who would purchase the ship and any cargo aboard, as well as pay a bounty for every captured enemy sailor. This money was then distributed to the crews of any ship that was involved in the action, as it was felt that even a ship that was standing off a short distance may well have encouraged the enemy ship to surrender rather than fight to the death. Allocation of this prize money was done by eighths. 2/8, or 1/4 of the prize money, went to the captain or commander of the ship. 1/8 went to the admiral or commander-in-chief who had signed the ship's orders, sending them out on the mission that resulted in the capture, unless the orders had come directly from the Admiralty in London, in which case this eighth also went to the captain. 1/8 was divided amongst the lieutenants, the sailing master, the captain of the Marines, if there was one, and another eighth was divided amongst the wardroom warrant officers, so these would be people like the surgeon, the purser, and the chaplain, along with standing warrant officers such as the carpenter, the boatswain, and the gunner, the lieutenant of the Marines, again, if there were Marines on board, and the master's mates. A further eighth, if you're keeping track, was divided amongst the junior warrant officers and petty officers, their mates, and that is an official Navy term, not just their friends, sergeants of the Marines, again, assuming Marines are aboard, the captain's clerk, surgeon's mate, and midshipman. The remaining 2/8 were divided amongst the rest of the crew, with able and specialist seamen receiving larger shares than ordinary seamen, landsmen, and boys. This 2/8 would be divided into shares, with each able seaman getting 2 shares of the pool, an ordinary seaman receiving a share and a half, landsmen receiving a share, and boys receiving half a share each. These were rated as 5th to 8th class shares. So, for the first part of the payout for these 2 captures, Pellew would have received the equivalent of about £2 million, assuming that he didn't also get the 1/8 if his orders had come straight from the Admiralty. Another £2 million equivalent would go to the lower ranked crew. Accounting for the overall size of the ship's crew, is roughly between £5,000 and £20,000 per regular crew member, depending on their exact position, whether they get a 5th or an 8th class share or something in between. And that's just the first payment for 2 captures. with the ship having already made a number of others. So you can see why a good captain could become vastly wealthy in a very short time, and even a regular crewman could, if he survived long enough and didn't drink it all, come out with more than enough money to set himself up very nicely after a good few years in naval service. Another 13 prizes, either alone or shared, were made over the following year before the Indefatigable would face its sternest test and its most famous battle. On the 13th of January 1797, the Indefatigable and the Amazon were patrolling in an attempt to catch the remnants of an attempted French invasion of Ireland, which had been dispersed and driven back largely by bad weather. In heavy fog, they spotted one of the last stragglers, the 74-gun ship of the line Droits de l'Homme, or Rights of Man. The French ship was substantially larger and significantly more heavily armed than the two frigates put together, and indeed it was of the type that had made the original layout of Indefatigable obsolete. It was also loaded with hundreds of troops, so boarding was quite definitely out of the question. On the other hand, the French vessel mistakenly believed that other British vessels were just over the horizon, and with an increasingly bad gale brewing along with a rocky shore nearby, and the fact the ship was already heavily laden, the commander was worried that the weather would prevent the use of Droits de l'Homme's lowest and heaviest main gun deck if the weather kept increasing in severity. And sure enough, as the French ship ran, the weather became worse and worse, ascending from a gale to a full-on storm, and then with elements of a blizzard thrown in for good measure. Using the Indefatigable's large sail area relative to its hull mass, Pellew was able to keep up with the French ship until the latter's topmasts broke, which slowed it down and allowed Indefatigable to overhaul it, and Amazon to begin catching up, as the smaller frigate had fallen considerably further behind. Luckily, the weather was now bad enough to prevent the French 74 from using its lower guns, which were already mounted lower than normal anyway, and with the topmasts gone, it was also rolling badly, which affected its aim to quite a substantial degree. Taking advantage of this, despite being vastly outmassed, the Indefatigable closed and crossed the stern of the French vessel, raking it at close range. Indefatigable then tried to loop around to go for a rake across the bow, whilst the French ship turned to try and ram. But the weather got the better of both of them, and they descended into a vicious circling engagement, not entirely unlike that whirlpool battle in Pirates of the Caribbean 3, but with substantially more French and substantially less fish people. Despite the lower gun deck being out of action, the French ships still had plenty of other cannon available, and the soldiers aboard were putting in their twopennyworth by pouring in musket fire as well. Although this dense pack of men meant that when one of the French cannons burst, there were a lot of casualties. In the midst of all this, the Amazon rolled up straight into pistol shot range with all sails set, and raked the Droits de l'Homme as well, which forced the French ship into ever more desperate efforts to stay out of a crossfire as the two British frigates circled and picked away at their prey. The French ship was now running low on ammunition, as an evening engagement had turned into a night engagement, and the duel continued well into the next morning, with over 4,000 cannonballs being fired purely by the French ship, let alone the two British ships. The British ships were periodically withdrawing to make repairs as they harried the French ship along, and then just before 4:30 in the morning, land was spotted amidst the wind, the waves, and the snow. The two British ships immediately broke for open sea in different directions, as the rocky shore was less than 2 miles away, whilst the battered French ship was simply driven inexorably towards the shore. Unfortunately for all parties, they found that during the battle they drifted into a bay, and with limited room to manoeuvre, only Indefatigable would actually make it out. HMS Amazon struck a sandbank and got stuck fast. Aboard the French vessel, the situation was far worse, Rigging and masts were collapsing under the pressure of the wind and battle damage, and only one of its anchors was still functional. This had very little effect, and the ship drifted sideways into another sandbank, which snapped off the remaining mast and caused the entire ship to roll over onto its side, whereas Amazon had managed to remain upright. Aboard the Amazon, order was maintained, boats were deployed, and as the storm lessened and rafts were built, the entire crew managed to make it safely to shore, apart from one small group of half a dozen men who stole the launch and ended up being capsized and drowned for their troubles. With Droits de l'Homme on its side, and most of the soldiers having no idea what to do, it was much, much worse on the French ship. Many of the boats had been destroyed, and the local sea conditions on its sandbank were considerably worse than they were at Amazon's position, resulting in many men being swept into the sea and drowned as the ship began to come apart under the battering waves, with small impromptu rafts largely being dashed to pieces on the rocks. It would be days before the last survivors were taken off by boats from arriving ships, or died from exposure or the sea. Prisoners from the captured privateer Cumberland, who had survived, were allowed to return to Britain in recognition of the efforts that they had made trying to save the lives of the men around them. Estimates on exactly how many men were lost vary, with most estimates reckoning around 600, but some running as high as 900 men, all drowned within sight of a friendly shore. Pellieu's command would last until 1799 and see at least 20 more prizes taken, mostly privateers, corvettes, and the occasional small frigate. Indefatigable would then spend the next few years under a variety of captains, gradually happily diminishing French shipping stocks one prize at a time. In 1804, the ship would see its next major action as the British became aware of a secret treaty between France and Spain that would pretty much force Spain to declare war in short order. This still being the era of the Spanish Empire, the Spanish were quite cleverly waiting until their treasure fleet from South America got in. The British decided that imitating Sir Francis Drake and making off with several ships' worth of gold, silver, and jewels was in fact an excellent way to start a war. And so, HMS Indefatigable, along with HMS Lively, HMS Medusa, and HMS Amphion, were waiting on the 5th of October as 4 loaded Spanish frigates came into sight off the coast of Portugal. After a few attempts to get the Spanish ships to surrender peacefully, somebody opened fire, and the whole thing degenerated into a melee. Within 10 minutes, the magazine of the Spanish ship Mercedes exploded, and half an hour later Santa Clara and Media had surrendered. The last remaining frigate, the Fama, ran for it, but was chased down, all 3 surviving treasure-laden vessels being taken back to the prize courts in the hopes of another big payout. Unfortunately for the crews, since the entire thing had taken place before war was technically declared, the Admiralty tried to claim the entire prize money as theirs. And since this added up to an equivalent purchasing power of £1.2 billion in today's money, you can probably see why. Eventually, they shared £160,000 of it in that time's money, which was the equivalent of a mere $222 million, which would be distributed, as we described previously, between the captains and crews of the 4 frigates involved in the fight. The rest of the Napoleonic Wars would see the ship go on to capture or assist in the capture of another 30 enemy vessels, including time spent on blockade duty off the western coast of France. As 1815 rolled around and peace was declared, Indefatigable had either directly captured or assisted in capturing at least 82 enemy vessels from various nations and of varying shapes and sizes. But unfortunately, this had all taken its toll, and despite being one of the relatively newer ships in the Royal Navy, she was thoroughly worn out by 1815 and would be paid off before being broken up in 1816.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.